Hey everyone, welcome back. It's Professor Howard. So this time around, we're going to be talking about this idea of experimental control. And that term is really uncomfortable. It sounds super draconian. It sounds like kind of like you're twirling your mustache and ooh, very 1984, Big Brother. We want to control people, make them do what we want. When a scientist, especially a social scientist, talks about experimental control, that's not what they're talking about. What they mean by experimental control is a certain level of confidence in the phenomenon of interest. That idea of really being able to say officially that you have a cause and effect relationship between an independent variable and a dependent variable. And to start off with, I want to talk about why that's so important. Now, I'm going to show you a few images here. It is worth noting that these images have come from news sources that are authorized, meaning that these are the intellectual property of someone else. So this particular video I'm putting together using these images under the fair use exception to copyright, but this particular video is not an openly licensed video. So just bear that in mind. When we're talking about why confidence in your independent variable is so important, you really have to think about the human element. When we're talking about the clients that we serve, very often we're making decisions clinically for folks who may have reduced capacity, who may not be able to make decisions for themselves. And what I'm showing you on screen here is a photo of a young person. And this is very likely a young person, probably on the autism spectrum. And their shirt reads, "Not being able to speak is not the same as not having anything to say." And we know that very often folks who experience autism may have some sort of communication deficit. It may be very difficult for them to vocalize and communicate their needs to others. Being a family member of a person who experiences autism or some other cognitive or intellectual developmental disability can also be challenging because you have a family member who you want to care for. You have someone that you want to open the world to. You want to be able to give them everything in life. But if they can't communicate their wants, needs, and desires, it's very difficult to make sure that their needs are being met. So there have been a number of ways in which folks who maybe can't communicate using the language of people around them have been supported in trying to find ways to communicate with others. And unfortunately, we've discovered that some of these methods work very, very well, and some methods work very, very poorly. Unfortunately, one of these methods that works very poorly is a technique called facilitated communication. So in facilitated communication, what happens is a paraprofessional is supposed to help and guide a person to communicate and spell out their wants, needs, and desires using a communication board. Now, this is very misleading because it shares a lot of similarities with a different form of augmented communication that's very often used, something called PACS, where a person can learn to exchange or communicate their wants, needs, or desires either by pressing a button on a device that will talk for them or by exchanging a card that has a photo of the thing that they want, need, or desire on it. In facilitated communication, what is supposed to happen is the person is supposed to spell out what they want and need. But as you might expect, that's kind of challenging because not only are you teaching the communicative response, but you're also trying to teach spelling at the same time. And what we see here is on the left side, I'm demonstrating a person holding a functional communication board. It's like a stencil of letters, and there's a child holding a pencil. And what we're expected to see here is that the child is going to move the pencil around to different letters that they want to see happen. Like I'm going to spell out COKE if I want a Coke or a soda of some kind. Unfortunately, what often happens is the client will hold the pencil still and the assistant will move the board around subtly to kind of get close to letters to communicate for the client. And so we see in facilitated communication, like on the left with the letter board, or even on the right with the person helping the client to reach and point to different buttons, that as much as we want to believe that it's the client communicating for themselves, what we've discovered a lot is that facilitated communication just isn't what we think it is. It's not the client communicating, and very often it's a paraprofessional communicating what they think the client wants And the worst part, the most misleading part, is the fact that the paraprofessional may not even be aware that it's happening. They may not even be aware that they're doing it. Now, this exposes clients to a lot of potential harm. And in one particularly high profile case, there was a professor in New York. She was a specialist in facilitated communication. And it came out that she had actually engaged in a sexual relationship with a client. And the most horrible part about it was the client with whom she had this relationship, she indicated had shared with her that he wanted to initiate a relationship with her using facilitated communication. Meanwhile, the client had never said anything like that to his family, and they were never able to get him to replicate the desire to be with this woman sexually. So there's some suggestion that it's possible that this particular professor had sexually assaulted a disabled man because she believed, using this facilitated communication, that he wanted to engage in a sexual relationship with her. So when we're talking about the need to actually demonstrate with rigor that the thing that we think is happening, we're talking about the need for scientific control, and we're talking about the fact that we have to protect people from pseudoscience, and we have to protect people from abuse. That's what we're talking about here. And so when we're talking about that level of scientific control, really what we mean is experiments. And that sounds, again, it sounds really strange. It sounds really weird, but behavior analysts, especially clinicians, are going to treat interventions like experiments. We never assume that a treatment is going to work for a client. We always test to be sure. And again, just to reiterate the importance here, we want to make sure that we are choosing a procedure that is effective, not just something that we think is going to be effective, because we have to demonstrate, even if effective in somewhere else, that it was also effective for our client. Right? We don't want to generalize needlessly to our client to believe that just because they share some similarity with others, that it's going to be effective. And we want to make sure that we're preventing harm as much as possible. And the way that we do that is through scientific methods, is through experimental control. So there's often a question of, what's the harm? Like, what's the harm of trying a treatment that hasn't proven to be effective? Remember that there was quite a lot of controversy around vaccines and trying to make sure that people were actually getting vaccinated. And this idea of, well, what's the harm? Maybe people are just making some decisions for their family, right? Maybe a family should have the right to decide for themselves whether or not they want their children to be vaccinated. And regardless of whatever your personal opinion about it is, we know from exhaustive research that vaccines do not cause autism. And unfortunately, we see that the decision that so many parents have made to choose not to get their children vaccinated has resulted in the resurgence of all of these conditions that we thought that we had otherwise eradicated. Children are dying from smallpox in Southern California because neighborhoods of children are not getting vaccinated. Parents are so afraid of the idea of autism that they don't even want to get their kids vaccinated. And where does this come from? Where do we get this idea of evidence? Well, a lot of times when we're talking about evidence, the evidence for how something isn't harmful or is harmful, the reasons that we make these decisions often boil down to the idea of an anecdote. Most of us are familiar with anecdotes. It's like, well, I experienced, or this is my, I saw someone who did this, or my cousin, this was effective for my cousin. But it's worth noting that this kind of evidence is really, really weak. An N of one study, or meaning that there's one participant, is just one person's story. And while narratively, it may be very rich, narratively, it could give you a lot of information about that experience. This is the very weakest kind of evidence, and this is very harmful when we're making decisions about what's going to work best for lots of people. So let's come back next time. We're going to talk about some of the drawbacks of between subjects designs, or between groups designs. We're going to talk about some of the limitations of statistical analysis. Then we're going to talk later about the single subject designs or time series designs that are used in behavior analysis.